Never cared. He never gave about all the innocent people. And this, the pompous father as a governor general, if he would have survived, he would have brainwashed me. I would have become a very right-winged, merciless person.
Gudrun, Edda, Niklas, Martin, these are not just names. They are the descendants of some of the most feared men of the 20th century. Himmler, Göring, Höss, Frank, Bormann, Höss, Speer or Mengele. Their surnames evoke a past marked by horror, carrying with them the weight of an inheritance impossible to ignore. They are heirs to a history they did not write. After 1945, many high-ranking officials declared themselves innocent before the courts. Society, eager to rebuild, preferred to believe that the guilt lay with a few, but within homes, another truth lingered. These leaders had also been fathers. What do you do with a surname associated with deportations, executions, and extermination camps? How far does a child's responsibility extend for acts they did not commit? The answers varied. Some remained silent for decades. Others tried to break with the inheritance but could not. Changing a name does not erase roots. Some sought spiritual refuge, religious conversion, a priestly or rabbinical vocation, as a way to separate themselves from the executioner's lineage. There were also those who made extreme choices to avoid passing on what they felt was a mark. Between denial, adherence, rejection, and guilt, each had to choose a way to live with the past. Judging a father is difficult. Distance is lacking, affection abundant. Yet some children firmly condemned the crimes without renouncing the bond. Others defended their parent until the end. Some were caught between filial love and historical evidence. At the same time, psychology and philosophy reminded us of something unsettling. Not all perpetrators fit the portrait of a monster. Sometimes evil takes ordinary forms, sustained by rules that legitimize it, and by the comfortable refusal to think independently. During the war, many of these children grew up protected, far from the front, with memories of meadows and mountains rather than bombings. Only afterward, with defeat, did the other side of the home emerge. Files, testimonies, photographs, orders. Then it became necessary to face what no one wanted to speak of. Some carried the surname with pride, others bore it as an inevitable burden. There were even those who claimed that running away changed nothing. This is the starting point, an uncomfortable inheritance that is not chosen, but one that shapes lives. From here, paths diverge. At one extreme, those who publicly break with the legacy. At the other, those who protect it as if it were a family treasure. Between these poles lie nuances, contradictions, and entire lives spent trying to answer a single question. How does one live with such a past? And then, the voice of a son willing to dismantle the image of his own father emerges. Among these heirs of the shadow, the most unsettling voice arises: Niklas Frank. The youngest son of the Governor-General of Poland, Hans Frank, known as the Butcher of Krakow. His childhood was imprinted with contradictory scenes. He was barely 4 years old when his mother took him for the first time to the ghetto. The official car stopped in front of high walls topped with barbed wire. From the window of the Mercedes, Niklas could barely make out the overcrowded streets, the exhausted bodies, the children with the yellow star sewn onto their arms. He asked why they were not smiling, why they looked at him with such harshness, but his mother told him to be quiet. He could not understand how such misery could coexist with the joy of wearing a new pair of leather shorts and a Sunday jacket. On another visit, he was allowed to walk a few dark streets. He remembered a guard shouting at an elderly woman and a phrase that froze him: "Don't worry, she'll be dead soon." The child broke into tears. That image, like so many others, would return years later when he voluntarily locked himself in a cold room to write about his father on an old Erica typewriter. At the same time, the life of the Franks in Krakow unfolded in an entirely opposite setting. Wawel Royal Castle, converted into the governor's residence, displayed Nazi flags from its towers and hosted banquets in its halls. Niklas and his brother played with toy cars in the corridors while the servants stepped aside, too afraid to scold them. Receptions were held with French wines, cigars and sweets served on silver trays, while in the nearby streets the population was dying of hunger. Over the years, Niklas came to understand his father's true role in the creation and administration of the ghettos, disguised as a protective measure. Hans Frank was a jurist turned absolute servant of Hitler, a man who publicly declared that his mission was to physically attack the Jewish race. In his territory, nearly 2 million people would be exterminated in Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. Niklas, the child his own family called the foreigner, grew up amid this stark contrast. A father who pursued him in games devoid of tenderness, a cold and distant mother, and a palace where culture mingled with barbarity. That contrast would forever shape his perspective. The images of his childhood in Krakow gradually became an insatiable need to know. Niklas refused to evade the truth. He sought it with relentless determination, even when it tore him apart. He stated it bluntly. His father was nothing more than a vain man, fascinated by castles, uniforms, and jewels. Human life for him had no value. Hans Frank proclaimed himself the German King of Poland, while at the same time making clear that the Poles did not deserve a sovereign, only a master. He was a jurist who presented himself as a martyr of the law, yet signed decrees of extermination. His power began to crumble in 1942, harassed by rivals within the regime who accused him of corruption and personal enrichment. Still, he remained in office until the Eastern Front collapsed. When defeat became inevitable, he fled Wawel Castle after organizing one last party and sending stolen masterpieces to Bavaria, paintings by Raphael, Rembrandt, and Leonardo. On May 4, 1945, he was arrested at his Alpine residence. He trusted that his 40 volumes of diaries would absolve him, unaware that they contained evidence of his direct responsibility in the annihilation of millions. He attempted suicide, first at the moment of his arrest, then in prison. From his cell, he blamed Hitler, Himmler, and Bormann, presenting himself as an obedient man caught in forces beyond his control. It was his lack of remorse that Niklas never forgave. When he visited his father before the sentence, he was 7 years old and already sensed that the words about coming home for Christmas were a cruel lie. The Nuremberg tribunal sentenced Hans Frank to the gallows in 1946. His mother, Brigitte, also fell. Interned in a denazification camp, she lived among the wives of other high-ranking officials. She returned hardened, without a trace of guilt. Over the years, she published her husband's memoirs under the title Facing the Gallows, which sold as a bestseller in post-war Germany, where silence was still the norm. Niklas chose a different path. In his books and interviews, he called his father a murderer and a criminal, without reservation. He extended his criticism to his mother and to German society, which preferred not to ask too many questions. His quest for truth made him the only one of his siblings willing to publicly bear that inheritance. And that solitary voice, refusing the comfort of forgetting, became a stark contrast to other Nazi children who chose the opposite path, uncritical defense and loyalty. Yet his search did not end at Nuremberg. Niklas continued digging through archives and testimonies, even the most uncomfortable. Among them was the old hypothesis of a possible Jewish ancestor in Hitler's family: letters, pensions, rumors. Leading historians dismiss it. For Niklas, the point was not to prove it, but to show the extent to which the regime had turned blood into a moral yardstick, while its leaders thrived on convenient ambiguities. The post-war years left Brigitte without palaces or silverware. There were makeshift rental rooms near train stations and nights on mattresses separated by sheets. For Niklas, however, the past became his compass. He studied law, history, and literature, ended up in editorial offices, Der Spiegel, Stern, covering culture, reports, controversies. Always a photo in his wallet, the lifeless body of Hans Frank. "It comforts me," he would say. "He is dead." His reckoning was also intimate. He imagined the 13 steps to the gallows, the priest, the rope, the final silence. After decades of research, he reached a harsh conclusion. He found no deep convictions, only greed and ambition. He believed that, had he been ordered to, his father would have constructed the same rhetoric against any other people. He admitted without indulgence traits they shared: eloquence, sharp wit, the ability to seduce with words. That is why, when he published My Father, A Reckoning, 1993, the impact was immediate. Colleagues of his generation accused him of crossing boundaries, relatives distanced themselves, and newspapers reproduced devastating passages many preferred not to read. The family was torn apart. Norman, the eldest, oscillated between denial, voluntary exile, and alcohol. He eventually accepted fragments of truth without relinquishing the paternal portrait on his bed. Sigrid defended unacceptable theses from South Africa. Brigitte, daughter, took her own life. Michael consumed himself in excesses. Niklas, the only one who persisted in reopening the wounds, even confessed that he wanted to kill his mother in 1959. He did not, but that attempt speaks more about accumulated resentment than any speech ever could. Today, he lives with his wife north of Hamburg and gives talks in schools. For half a century, he has been dismantling the Reich jurist using the same method: documents, memory, and a will to see without anesthesia. This commitment has repeatedly put him at odds with other descendants who prefer to soften the past. Among them is a figure who chose a different path, protecting the memory of his father until the end, the children of Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz. For them, childhood was marked by a brutal contradiction. In the garden of their home, located next to the camp, flowers were tended by prisoners and strawberries were covered in ash falling from the chimneys. The children played with animals, enjoyed a pool and slide, and received toys made by inmates. Meanwhile, just a few meters away, millions were being sent to their deaths. Domestic life appeared idyllic. Hedwig, the mother, transformed the house into a luxurious home with fine furniture, artworks and goods taken from the Canada warehouses, where items confiscated from the victims were stored. There were servants in striped uniforms serving the family, forced to perform gardening or kitchen duties. In family photographs, the Höss children appear smiling, seemingly oblivious, or perhaps accustomed, to the smoke darkening the sky. Rudolf Höss was a diligent executor, not a brilliant ideologue. Born in 1901 in Baden-Baden, he grew up under the strict discipline of a fanatic father and an education aimed at the priesthood. The War of 1914 sent him to the front as a mere adolescent, and he soon discovered blind obedience as his personal refuge. After the defeat, he joined the Freikorps, participated in violent actions, and was eventually convicted of murder. This early experience of absolute submission to authority would mark the rest of his life. In the late 1920s, he met Hedwig Hensel, with whom he shared National Socialist ideals and a desire for rural life. They married in 1929 and had 5 children, but he soon abandoned the farm to join the SS under Himmler's mentorship. At Dachau and Sachsenhausen, he trained as a specialist in camp administration, learning that the goal was not only to oversee, but to break prisoners morally and physically. In 1940, he was assigned to create a new camp in Poland, on the site of a former barracks in Oswiecim. He named it Auschwitz. From then on, the family routine existed alongside the machinery of extermination. Höss combined afternoons reading stories to his children with days supervising mass murders. His efficiency and lack of scruples made him a central figure in the final solution. While his children grew up surrounded by gardens, animals, and parties, their father perfected an industrial system of death. This double life, affectionate at home, executioner in the camp, reveals in a chilling way how ordinary life could coexist with absolute horror. The domestic logic did not pause. Outside the walls, the operation expanded relentlessly. From Berlin came demands for enlargement. Höss recorded them coldly. Obstacles only fueled his zeal. After Himmler's visit in 1941, the goal was no longer a camp for 30,000, but a complex capable of holding 100,000 prisoners of war. In the autumn, Birkenau began. New barracks, nearby tracks, a sealed perimeter. That same year, Zyklon B was tested. The insecticide, originally intended for disinfection, became an efficient method. Höss justified it as a clean solution, less disturbing for the executioners than machine guns. Murder was industrialized, reduced to shifts, figures, and output. In his memoirs, he described the first opening of the gas chamber. Isolated screams, then a wail, a futile stampede against the doors. Afterwards, silence and piled bodies. A routine was imposed: motivate the SS each morning, increase the pace of the ovens, report numbers. Compassion was weakness. The task was bookkeeping. Inside the house, the facade persisted. A father who tucked in his children, kissed his wife at dawn, wrote poems about the beauty of Auschwitz. Hedwig, the angel of Auschwitz, demanded flawless service to receive Himmler, Eichmann, Glücks. Luxury arrived from Canada, clothing, linens and household goods looted from those awaiting death. A prisoner gardener would recall banquets, endless orders for wine, sugar and meat, and the mistress's phrase, "I could live here forever." When the children played at imitating prisoners with capo armbands, their father interrupted the game with severity, but never spoke of his work. He only increased his harshness, his silence. At the end of 1943, Höss was transferred to the SS Central Office. He returned in 1944 to oversee the extermination of more than 400,000 Hungarian Jews. For weeks, smoke blackened the sky for miles. Then came the flight, bombed roads, nights without lights, forests as refuge. The family ended up in a Nordic hut, without beds or blankets, he under a false name and doing farm work. The British pressured Hedwig and the children. Capture came in March 1946. Before the judges, Höss was a model defendant, precise, impassive, faithful to the Weltanschauung that had shaped him. He saw himself as an executor, not responsible. He asked them to remember that he also had a heart. But while he wrote those lines, the question that would not stop hovering, inside his home and beyond the wall, kept growing unanswered without consolation. In the end, he wrote that he loved his family as much as National Socialism. He dreamed of a farm as an intimate homeland for his own, a solid education, a powerful nation to bequeath. 5 days before the end, he left letters. He asked his wife to flee far away and to reclaim her maiden name. "Let mine disappear with me." To his children, that they should think for themselves, with humanity and their own judgment. On April 16, 1947, he was hanged in front of Auschwitz, some 50 meters from what had been his home. For his family, the war began anew that day. Poverty, isolation, reproaches from the neighborhood. With no pension or assistance, they survived in St. Michaelisdon. Later, each sought their own path. Klaus to Australia, others to the Baltic, and Brigitte III toward a nomadic life. First Spain, Balenciaga's milieu, then Liberia, Greece, Iran, Vietnam, and finally the United States. She married, had 2 children, and hid her surname as if it were another skin. In Washington, she worked for decades in a luxury store whose owners, Jews expelled on Kristallnacht, chose not to fire her when, one night over drinks, she confessed her origin. She kept silent. To her children, she said that her father had died in the war. She buried her mother under another name. Retired and ill, she agreed to speak for a book, but without surnames or identifying details. She still feared the echo of that past. She explained the duality she could never reconcile, the best father in the world and the commander of Auschwitz. She insisted that he had been only a subordinate. Rainer Höss, son of Hans-Jürgen, suddenly learned who his grandfather was, the boss of the worst mass murderers. Family silence pushed him to the archives, to the garden photos at Auschwitz, to the uncomfortable evidence. He carried the inheritance like a stone. Suicide attempts, asthma crises, 3 heart attacks. His family branded him a traitor. He imposed a task on himself, that the burden should not fall on his own children. He denounced, exposed himself, and was also criticized, accused of opportunism, of trying to place his grandfather's objects in Yad Vashem, of commercializing memory. Even so, he repeated, "Not changing your surname does not erase anything." He sought out a survivor, his grandfather's barber. He heard the line that hurts like a mirror. "You are your grandfather's portrait." And yet he said, if he knew where he was buried, he would go to his grave. In 2014, he lent his voice to a campaign against extremism. Never forget to vote, because far-right movements have learned faster than we have. And as he speaks, the line connecting a house with ash-covered strawberries, a wall separating a garden from a gas chamber, and a surname that cannot be hidden, continues to cast its shadow across Europe. While Rudolf Höss's children grew up in the shadow of Auschwitz, another descendant of the Nazi elite became a symbol of loyalty to the Third Reich's legacy, Gudrun Himmler. Decades after the war's end, her presence persisted at secret gatherings of nostalgics, where former Waffen-SS soldiers were received as misunderstood heroes. To them, she was not just Heinrich Himmler's daughter, but the princess of Nazism, guardian of a forbidden memory. At these clandestine assemblies, Gudrun commanded respect. She interrogated each veteran with an inquisitive tone, as if to revive her father's lost authority. The men, many marked by age, responded proudly when mentioning their units or wartime pasts. Before them, she represented a lineage that had never renounced its roots. The Reichsführer SS's daughter maintained the conviction that her father had been unjustly condemned, aspiring to rehabilitate his name in history. Her devotion had begun in childhood. Gudrun was Himmler's only legitimate daughter, whom he affectionately called Puppy, his little doll. From a young age, she accompanied him on official visits, even to Dachau, the first concentration camp. At 12, while observing emaciated uniformed prisoners, her attention was only on the vegetable gardens and greenhouses, as if that horrific setting were just another backdrop in her father's ascent. A photograph immortalized that day, smiling, holding Himmler's hand, in the midst of a world of oppression she could not yet comprehend. Her bond with her father was absolute. In her diary, Gudrun celebrated every new position Himmler attained, writing with childlike enthusiasm when he was appointed Minister of the Interior. That man, frail in youth and insecure about his physique, had found in discipline and racial fanaticism a way to impose himself. As head of the SS and the Gestapo, he became the architect of the concentration camp system and the planned extermination of millions. Privately, however, he remained a present father to Gudrun. Himmler maintained constant contact with her through letters and calls, which, though never revealing his crimes, reinforced their familial bond. In these letters, he only mentioned fatigue and the heavy tasks of his work, deliberately hiding the horrors beneath. To his daughter, he was the loving father who called and devoted time to her, while simultaneously designing the most relentless machinery of extermination in the 20th century. Heinrich Himmler's agenda recorded domestic routines with cold precision, played with the children, conversation with Puppy. Between the lines lay the mandate: obedience, cleanliness, impeccable notes. When Gudrun failed, the Reichsführer exploded. At home, discipline was a virtue. In the state, a dogma. At the beginning of 1938, Himmler began a relationship with his secretary, Hedwig Potthast. Under his pronatalist doctrine, Helga was born in 1942 and Nanette Dorothea in 1944. Hedwig was installed in Schönau, near Berchtesgaden, kept sheltered and in the shadows, waiting for a post-war that never came. Marga, the wife, recorded the offence with weary resignation, donned her nurse's cap again, and served in the Red Cross. In Poland, her pen revealed an unabashed anti-Semitism. Gudrun, meanwhile, grew up alone in Gmund. Her father forbade her from moving to Berlin. The bombings made the capital a threat. Nervous and with stomach aches, the girl followed the war from school and in her notebook. On June 22, 1941, she wrote to her father, "It is awful that we are waging war on Russia. Russia is so vast." By 1943, her diary already dreamed of an estate in the east when peace came. Brighter corridors, larger rooms, a house in Obersalzberg. The imagery of victory permeated the architecture of her desires. The Normandy landings and the Soviet advance shattered that illusion. It would be unthinkable to lose, she told herself in July 1944. That same month, her father ordered a bunker dug in the Gmund garden with prisoners from Dachau. Himmler's visits grew ever shorter. 3-4 days, then letters with photos, packages of chocolate and cheese, sometimes tins weighing dozens of kilos, privileges that endured even rationing. In March 1945, Gudrun noted her frustration. The Luftwaffe still bad, Göring does nothing, Goebbels does too much, her father always in the background. She saw him for the last time in November 1944. The last call came at the end of March 1945. In January, mother and daughter left Gmund and fled south. The bunker was no longer sufficient. On May 13th, while seeking refuge near Bolzano, they were captured. Transfers, interrogations, false names. If they say they are Himmler, they'll tear them apart, they were warned. Gudrun went on a hunger strike in Cinecittà. She won better rations. From Milan to Paris, from Versailles to Nuremberg, she repeated, she knew nothing. By then, her father was already dead. On May 23, 1945, after revealing his identity, he bit a cyanide capsule he had kept in his mouth. 12 minutes later, it was over. Gudrun learned this indirectly in August. Fever kept her bedridden for weeks. She refused to believe in suicide. For her, he had been murdered. Interned until 1946, without money or a destination, mother and daughter were taken in at a convent in Stuttgart under discreet identities. The nuns never saw her cry or laugh. "I want to continue as my father," Gudrun said, clinging to a faith and a surname the world rejected. Over time, denazification dismantled prisons, not convictions. The girl who had loved her affectionate father unreservedly had to confront the architect of terror. When she finally understood the magnitude of the crime, she could no longer invoke the private morality that had justified him. But she chose another battle. In the post-war period, she would turn filial loyalty into a public cause and herself into a living relic of a past that refused to die. After the fall came social coldness. In 1947, Gudrun appeared at a school of applied arts. The director saw the surname and shut the door. "My father was the Reichsführer SS," she said without hesitation. One semester later, through political intervention, she was admitted. She chose to learn sewing, fine stitches for an awkward biography. In the 1950s, she separated from her mother, tried her luck in Munich, and sought out Himmler's extramarital children. Hedwig Potthast prevented it. She rebuilt her life in the Black Forest. Her 2 children grew up in secrecy. Every time Gudrun said Himmler, it was like a lightning strike. Dismissals, evictions, heavy glances, and yet she decided not to let go of the surname. In 1955, she traveled to London, mingled with Mosley and descendants of the regime. She returned proud and immediately unemployed. She transformed her apartment on Jorgenstrasse into a shrine, paintings, medals, busts, photographs, relics to ward off forgetting. In public, the same litany. Her father, a good man. History, a conspiracy of slanders. She gave only one interview in 1959. The rest was devotion and silence. Soon, nostalgia gave way to action. In 1951, she joined Stille Hilfe, silent help, for prisoners and detainees. Noble protectors, diligent lawyers, discreet sacristies, and a network that supported notorious culprits. She also promoted the Viking Jugend, a late echo of the Hitler Youth, later banned. When journalists asked about her work, she responded with a wall. "I do not speak. I do what I can when I can." Not all of the family chose her path. Katrin Himmler, great-niece, carried a guilt that sometimes skips generations. She married a descendant of the Warsaw Ghetto, wrote the Himmler brothers, and severed ties. In Gudrun, however, there were no cracks. Without critical distance, without mourning, she transformed filial piety into activism. And so, arm in arm with her absent father, she continued walking backward. But not all descendants of Nazi leaders followed that same path. Some carried the weight of the surname in silence, trapped in a destiny overshadowed by their parents. Wolf Rüdiger Höss was one of them. His childhood was shaped by the most enigmatic and desperate decision of the Third Reich, his father Rudolf Hess's solo flight to England. One night in May 1941, the regime's second man, Hitler's loyal deputy, donned a new Luftwaffe uniform, embraced his young son for the last time, and took off in a Messerschmitt Bf 110 bound for Scotland. He claimed to be a messenger of peace. He insisted he wanted to prevent Europe from being covered in children's coffins. His mission, according to him, was to offer an agreement to Churchill. The Reich would respect the British Empire if England left Germany free to act on the continent. It was an obsessive, almost mystical idea, nourished by dreams and visions, convinced he was interpreting the Führer's will. For hours he flew alone over the North Sea, defying the laws of aerodynamics and the predictions of his own technicians. At 11 o'clock at night, believing he had reached his destination, he parachuted into a field in Scotland. He was immediately detained. To the British, the man requesting to speak with the Duke of Hamilton was little less than an enigma. To Hitler, it was an unforgivable betrayal. Rudolf Hess went from the regime's heir apparent to the uncomfortable ghost of Nazism. Interned in England, accused of madness and later seated at Nuremberg, he ended his days in Spandau prison. And amidst all of this grew his son, Wolf Rüdiger, The boy who, after his father's solo flight in May 1941, was left alone with his mother, forever marked by a surname he never chose, but that would accompany him like a lifelong sentence. The boy grew up with an absence and a rumor that his father was insane. In England, Rudolf Höss saved scraps of food to test for poisoning and switched trays with officers for fear of some substance. If it's hot, he'll say they are burning him. If cold, that they are freezing him, Goering joked at Nuremberg. For Wolf Rudiger, it was not madness. It was the price of having attempted peace. The fall of the air erased the surname from facades and classrooms. Ilse and her son left Munich and sought refuge in Bad Oberdorf, among mountains that the father had imagined as a character-building school for his mountain boy. From his cell, Höss oversaw the boy's education, chess by mail, lessons, admonitions. "Let something burn you," he wrote, "even if no one publishes it or believes it." The son kept that maxim as a talisman. The Nuremberg verdict did not convict him of crimes against humanity, but sentenced him to life imprisonment for crimes against peace. He was 8 years old when he heard, "Your father will live." He understood it the opposite way. His father would not live, and he decided the sentence was an injustice. Spandau became a metaphor, a fortress for 7 men and for decades for just one. Höss chose isolation and rejected family visits for 24 years. Outside, Wolf Rudiger learned to respond to playground insults with a mixture of disarmament and childish pride. Then came the blow of the post-war years. In 1947, Ilse was detained and shared a barrack with other Reich widows. The boy was brought to see her. There he discovered that there were others like him, children who played among barbed wire and surnames. He tried boarding schools, changed schools, and was rejected in Salem for being the son of. His mother published a book presenting Höss as a prisoner of peace. As a young man, he traveled, fell ill, studied engineering, and refused to serve in the Bundeswehr. "How could I serve those who condemned my father?" He won exemption as a conscientious objector and devoted himself to a personal mission, rehabilitating Rudolf Höss. He gathered signatures, convinced prominent figures, and repeated one thesis. The flight to Scotland was neither madness nor a power grab. It was an implicit command from the Führer. Psychiatric diagnoses, depression, hypochondria, schizophrenia, seemed to the family like political labels. Doctors described capricious amnesias. Goering said Höss deceived the court. To the son, it was all noise. The only clear images were 3 photos hung above a bed: wife, son, Führer, and later only 2 when Nuremberg arrived. In 1969, the old prisoner's ulcer opened a crack. Finally, on Christmas Eve, Wolf Rudiger saw him again, 75 years old, no right to an embrace, no gifts, with interpreters and directors sitting nearby, as if affection too had to be guarded. The first hug would not come until 1982. All questions, everyone, remained unanswered. Wolf Rudiger turned that suspense into books. My Father, Rudolf Höss, 1986. Who Killed My Father, Rudolf Höss, 1989. I Regret Nothing, 1994. There he set his creed. There was no madness, there was mission. There was no suicide, there was crime. And above all, there was a son who chose to live and fight in the long shadow of a surname. Spandau reduced a roman to a ritual of 12 letters a year, each fewer than 1,300 words, censored to the point that even a greeting to the dog was forbidden. Wolf Rudiger kept the annual parcels as if they were stations of a private Via Crucis. After the release of Speer and von Schirach, his father was left alone, the world's most expensive prisoner, an entire prison for a single inmate. The son never stopped fighting. In 1987, he thought he saw a crack. For the first time in 2 decades, the Soviet embassy responded. A meeting was scheduled and a parole request submitted. When he went to tell him, he found Rudolf Höss extremely weakened, unable to walk without assistance. On August 17th came the sudden blow. A call in English, he passed away at 16:10, with no details. The next day, outside the locked Spandau, he heard the official version, suicide by cable in the garden shed. He was 93. Wolf Rudiger saw nerves, obstacles, silences, and decided that his father had been murdered. He commissioned a second autopsy. It also mentioned asphyxiation, but noted pressure marks consistent with strangulation. 2 guards mentioned men from British services. The son even invoked the shadow of the CIA and a farewell note, "out of character." Why, he asked, would key documents remain classified for decades? He visited his father 102 times. After the news, he himself suffered a heart attack. Spandau was demolished immediately to prevent pilgrimages. By agreement with the Allies, there was a family burial in Bavaria. Years later, in 2011, the grave was exhumed and the ashes scattered at sea to break the neo-Nazi magnet. Yet every August, the nostalgics still gather. Nothing moved Wolf Rüdiger from his creed. Rudolf Hess was not a criminal, but a victim. The Nuremberg laws, a translation of religious wills. The gas chambers, technically impossible. The invasion of Poland, protection of German minorities. This revisionism led him to head the Rudolf Hess Gesellschaft and to educate his children in the veneration of their grandfather. One of them, Wolf Andreas, born on April 20th, would repeat the cult online and be fined for Holocaust denial. Proud of his surname, he said that rather than cursing it, it opened doors. He died in 2001 after 10 years of dialysis, convinced of 2 things: that his father had been killed and that Germany had been a victim of history. Niklas Frank, the son of the Governor-General of Poland, saw in that destiny a burden even crueler than his own. Side by side, 2 opposite inheritances, one of cult, the other of rupture, and in between, a generation of children learning to live, or not to live, with the echo of a surname. While Wolf Rüdiger Hess dedicated his life to rehabilitating his father's image, there were other children who took very different paths. One of the most notable was Martin Adolf Bormann, known as Krönzi in childhood, the crown prince of Nazism for being the eldest son of the man who had pulled the strings of power in the shadows. Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary. That child's life began marked by a symbol. Born in 1930 in Grunwald, he was the first godson of the Führer himself, who gave him his second name, Adolf. His godparents were none other than Adolf Hitler and the wife of Rudolf Hess. But that inheritance, which seemed an honor within the Third Reich, would soon become an unbearable burden. His childhood was surrounded by luxury, but also by rigid isolation. He grew up alongside his 9 siblings in the Führer's innermost circle at Obersalzberg, where the children of Nazi leaders played under the protection of the SS, oblivious to the reality of a continent at war. There, young Krönzi quickly learned he was different. While his peers attended catechism classes, he was excluded because his father, fanatically anti-religious, believed he didn't need it. This environment profoundly shaped his childhood. His mother, Gerda Bormann, was a regime fanatic and a firm promoter of polygamy in the name of the cause. His father, by contrast, paid him little attention, and when he did, it was with severity. The boy grew up without paternal warmth, without emotional communication, educated to venerate the Führer as if he were a divine emissary. At 10, Martin Adolf was sent as punishment to the Nazi boarding school at Feldafing, an elite Reich institution training future cadres of Nazism. Discipline was harsh, integration difficult, but there he confronted the brutal ideological void of his father. He remembered it clearly. One day he asked what Nazism was, and Martin Bormann's answer was as simple as it was revealing. National Socialism is the will of the Führer. To his son, those words summed up the essence of the regime. There were no clear principles, only blind obedience to one man. In 1943, during a visit to the boarding school, he received his last direct instruction from his father. 2 years later, the collapse of the Reich would sever that bond forever. Martin Adolf was only 15 when the Bormann world fell apart. The night of May 1st, 1945, broke the Crown Prince. When the radio went silent with the news of the Führer's death, a dense silence settled, pierced only by sporadic gunfire. For Krönzi, it was the end. Yet it was also the beginning, the almost physical intuition that survival meant learning to live without the myth. With his school dispersed, he returned to Obersalzberg, wearing the red armband of the Hitler Youth, and was met with a curt order: burn the uniform, change the surname, disappear. With false documentation, Bergmann, and a borrowed grey jacket, he embarked on a mateless flight. Salzburg, St. Johann, farm labour, empty stations, and a sudden cry when he mistook a Mercedes for his mother's car. He lived convinced that if he were discovered, he would be executed for being Martin Bormann's son. He didn't know if his father was alive. The war ended for him on a farm in Hintertell, south of Salzburg. There he was welcomed without questions. There he learned to tend livestock and, above all, to pray. In that wooden kitchen, among warm bread and damp newspapers, he encountered for the first time a word he had never heard at Obersalzberg: Holocaust. Photos from Bergen-Belsen shattered his sheltered childhood. The workers of Dachau he had seen as a child had nothing to do with those living skeletons staring at the camera. He discovered the abyss and a responsibility that was not guilt, but neither was it forgetfulness. The fourth commandment asks us to honor our parents as parents, he would later say, not their positions or their crimes. He learned to separate the intimate father from the official of evil, leaving ultimate judgment to God. At the same time, he accepted that his progenitor had fought against the church he was beginning to love. In 1947, he requested baptism in the Catholic Church and trained with the missionaries of the Sacred Heart in Salzburg. There were denunciations, a brief arrest by the CIC, and the intervention of the Archbishop to secure his release. That same year, he learned of the death of his mother, Gerda, the Reich's devout follower who would eventually request a religious burial, while his siblings were placed with foster families and for the most part converted to Catholicism. Some died young, others chose the silence of Tyrol. He took another path, that of the seminary. Martin Adolf Bormann was ordained a priest in 1958. He celebrated his first Mass at Maria Kirchenthal, the church near his refuge. For years, he said, he feared the shadow of his father and the hatred of those who might mistake him for him. "I do not hate him," he repeated. "I learned to distinguish the individual from the politician." Upon that divide, he built a life that was the opposite of a cult of power, a vocation of service that at last required no surname. After the war, the name Martin Bormann became a ghost. Rumors of impossible escapes, secret KGB operations, and clandestine medical treatments by Mengele in Paraguay circulated. For decades, his son lived without certainty. It was not until 1972, when a skeleton found in Berlin was identified as his father's, that the enigma seemed to close, though doubts never fully disappeared. Meanwhile, Martin Adolf charted a path opposite to that of his progenitor. In 1961, he left as a missionary for the Congo amid civil war. There he encountered violence, torture, and mock executions. He survived, and in that extreme he understood his life as a gift from Providence. In 1971, a severe car accident led him to another crossroads. Upon awakening from a coma, he met a nun who would become his wife. He renounced his vows, and together they devoted their lives to education and the teaching of faith. From 1973 until his retirement in 1992, he taught religion in Bavaria, the same classes he had been forbidden to attend as a child for carrying the Bormann name. In parallel, he participated in meetings organized by Israeli psychologist Dan Bar-On, where children of Holocaust survivors and descendants of Nazi criminals shared memory and silence. There, he grasped the difference. The children of survivors inherited an unspeakable trauma. He, in contrast, had carried the burden of secrecy, the constant fear of being discovered as the son of a high-ranking official. After retiring, he traveled to Israel in 1993, tracing the biblical Exodus, and was captivated by a land his parents would have dismissed. He wrote about the manipulation of language in Nazi propaganda, analyzing even his father's letters. For years, he led workshops in Germany, the United States, and Israel, seeking to build bridges where there had once been walls. In 1995, when Ilse Hess, Rudolf Hess's godmother and wife, died, it was he who delivered the funeral prayer. Old childhood bonds intertwined in tragedy, reunited once more under the irreversible shadow of history. Martin Adolf Bormann passed away on March 11, 2013. He had lived as the son of one of the most feared men of the Third Reich and had chosen to be a priest, teacher, and witness. Confronted with the silence that dominated his childhood, he chose speech, that of faith, dialogue, and an uncomfortable but necessary memory. Through his life, he showed that even from the darkest lineage, another path can be pursued. After exploring the stories of other descendants of the Third Reich, the narrative now turns to the figure of Horst von Wechter. He was born in Vienna in April 1939, baptized in honor of Horst Wessel, a martyr who became a symbol of the Nazi Party. His father, Otto von Wechter, was a fervent National Socialist from the start, and during the war he rose to the position of governor in the region of Galicia in present-day Ukraine. Horst's childhood was shaped by an environment that combined privilege and apparent normality with the shadow of a criminal regime. His earliest memories place him in the summer of 1945, when he turned 6. The fall of the Reich coincided with his birthday, and that day he realized, without fully understanding, that his world was collapsing. He remembered the house trembling under Allied bombs and the sudden sense that the future had vanished. Decades later, sitting in his ruined castle, transformed into a refuge for artists, he would show visitors a peculiar fascination with stones, symbols, and numbers. He evoked architecture as if it were the thread running through his life, a way to steer the conversation toward the timeless, avoiding direct confrontation with the immediate past of his family. Among family photo albums were images of Adolf Hitler, visits to Dachau, or scenes at Wawel Castle in Krakow, where his mother posed smiling alongside Nazi officials. To an outside observer, these snapshots reveal the intimate proximity of his family to the core of National Socialist power. For Horst, however, they were domestic memories, vacation moments, childhood games, and winter walks. One of the most revealing episodes from his childhood was a visit to the Krakow ghetto. He recalls sitting in the back seat of the family Mercedes, surrounded by downtrodden crowds, and sticking his tongue out at a boy his own age who was watching from outside. The nanny silently reprimanded him, making him understand that the gesture was cruel, even though, at that moment, he experienced it only as childish play. His mother, meanwhile, wandered through the ghetto seeking furs and luxury goods. For the Jews forced to sell, that encounter may have offered a fleeting illusion of survival. The governor's wife might have secured them just one more day of life. His parents' marriage was crumbling at the same pace as the war. Otto von Wechter demanded a divorce, but his wife appealed directly to Hitler, who formally forbade the separation until after the conflict. In a letter filled with desperation, Otto himself described mountains of corpses and begged his wife to release him from the bond. She refused. In this private drama, Horst grew up trapped in a family where loyalty to the Führer weighed more than love between them. With the collapse of the Reich came an internal fracture as well. "I always thought Poland was ours," he would later recall. The real blow was not immediate. It came when silence broke and the evidence of horror became visible. His mother dreamed of a son who would become a lawyer, supported by old networks of influence. He chose to break with that path. He rejected the inheritance, sought to be useful, assisted a Jewish painter, and traveled to New Zealand. It was more than a biographical turn. It was an act of rupture, a way of saying, "I will not accept an imposed destiny." Yet the bond with his father never disappeared. Horst insists that Otto opposed racial theory, tried to do good, and even protested to Hitler over the treatment of the population. When the Lemberg ghetto was established, he claims, the signature was the SS's, not his father's. When Himmler suggested Otto return to Vienna, he maintains that Otto had no choice. He repeats a constant line: if there were an unequivocal document ordering killings, he would condemn it. Until such a document appears, he defends his father's name. But history does not fit into an absent signature. In public events, Horst was confronted with letters, orders, and the administrative context his father exercised. The district of Galicia, with its capital in Lviv, the mass deportations of the summer of 1942, the civil chain of command authorizing salaries and logistics. In the old parliamentary hall, where measures were announced that led to tens of thousands of murders, the evidence resonated with force. The machinery did not move on its own. It required consent, coordination, and presence. And Wechter was there. Horst clings to another narrative, the Ukrainian veneration for the Galicia division, that he did what he could in the face of an inevitable system. Yet law and memory converge on an uncomfortable truth. Civil authority did not need to fire a weapon to be responsible. It was enough to sustain the infrastructure that made every shot possible. At its core, his defense is not just about Otto von Wechter, it is about himself. If the father was decent, the son can live in peace. But the question that remains is larger than a surname. What happens when intimate affection clashes with historical truth? Here there is no refuge, only an uncomfortable certainty remains. In crimes of state, the absence of a signature does not erase the trace of the power that made them possible. The document that seemed to be missing surfaced in 1946 from a Polish archive, a request to the United States authorities to extradite Vector for mass murder, shootings and executions. It identified him in his capacity as governor of the District of Galicia as responsible for more than 100,000 deaths. Horst views it and reduces it to generalities, to Soviet language, to post-war politics. But the document was not isolated. It was accompanied by letters, chains of command and records. Otto's missive to his wife announcing the gross action, the payrolls of the auxiliary police whose salaries his office signed, the lists that sustained the machinery. He may not have signed every order, but the weight of command bore his name. In the historic hall of Lviv, once a parliament and later a university, those proclamations that opened the door to extermination are recalled. Horst insists, it was rhetoric, it was an inevitable system, he tried to prevent it. The evidence responds with a simple question. If he did not exercise power, who authorized uniforms, police cords, budgets and trains? The law calls it command responsibility. Memory calls it moral responsibility. The march toward the forest leaves no room for excuses. On March 25, 1943, 3,500 people, including the narrator's family, were driven there. They stepped onto a makeshift plank and received a bullet to the head before falling into the pit. Nothing was exhumed. The earth still holds their bodies. Horst demands the exact chain of orders, names and ranks. The place answers with silence. Historical precision matters, but it does not erase the line connecting a governor's office to the blood-stained ground. Today, in Lviv, the commemoration of the Galicia division reveals another aspect. Resignified symbols, local pride, a contested memory that tries to separate military merit from criminal context. There, Horst finds Hans thanking him for his father, and in that gesture he seeks solace. But the risk repeats itself. When private affection becomes a public alibi, history opens again falsely. In the end, Horst insists that Otto was decent and did what he could. The lesson his obstinacy leaves is not legal, but human. Because to love is not to absolve, and to understand is not to justify. And because every great massacre begins with an intimate renunciation, denying the obvious when the truth is already written in the earth. Throughout this journey, we have traversed lives marked by a heritage impossible to erase. Sons and daughters of Nazi leaders, each confronted with the same dilemma: accept the weight of their parents' crimes or deny them to preserve the family memory. Their testimonies echo a common truth. World War II did not end in 1945. It continued to beat within their biographies, like a shadow that never fades. What we have seen are not merely private stories, but fragments of a broader truth. The perpetrators did not vanish alone. They left behind families who had to grow up amidst shame, guilt, or denial. Some chose to erect temples to their father's memory. Others transformed their lives into a plea condemning their own origins. This intimate fracture reveals just how much Nazism was not only a political project, but also a poisoned legacy that reached into the next generation. And here lies the most uncomfortable lesson. Horror is transmitted not only in numbers or judgments, but also in inherited silences, in family photographs, in childhood memories that intersect with scenes of extermination. It is this mix of the domestic and the criminal that forces us to look without turning away, showing how the monstrous can coexist with the everyday, how one could return from the ghetto to dinner with family or kiss a child after signing death orders. The children of Nazis confront us with a difficult mirror. What would we have done? Would we have broken with everything to seek the truth, or defended our parents to preserve our identity? There are no simple answers, but there are clear warnings. One of them is that evil does not perpetuate itself solely through the fanatics who direct it, but also through those who excuse it, relativize it, or justify it under the guise of affection. Today, as Europe and the world once again hear speeches of hate, as symbols and slogans thought buried resurface, listening to these children becomes an urgent reminder. They bore what should never have been repeated, and their contradictions, denials, or confessions tell us that memory is a permanent battlefield where historical truth confronts the desire to forget or to rewrite. This documentary is not just a journey into the past, it is a warning for the present. Because every time someone downplays a crime, every time violence is relativized, or obedience is invoked as justification, the door reopens to that which we believed impossible. The story of the children of the executioners reminds us that true inheritance is not in blood, but in choices, and that the only way to break the cycle is to assume the responsibility they, in their time, refused to bear. Because what is denied returns. What is remembered prevents.